Hello, everyone. This is Chris Lim with the TheoTech podcast. Today, I'm delighted to share this conversation with Dr. Jonathan Downie, the founder and owner of Integrity Languages. He's also the author of a new book called Multilingual Church: Strategies for Making Disciples in All Languages. In this episode, we discuss some of his findings and insights into multilingual churches from his professional experience as an interpreter and consultant. Let's tune in. Dr. Jonathan Downie, or Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great fun to be here. I love these relaxed conversation style podcasts.
Yes, that's how we like to do it on the TheoTech podcast. I know that I've looked at some of your work, and I know that you have lots of opinions about AI translation and churches and making disciples. But before we dive into those things, maybe you can give us some of the backstory. How did you enter this world of interpretation? And furthermore, what gives you that passion for interpretation in church?
So actually, the two stories are the same. I think about I must have been about 17. No, I would have been about 19, sorry. I went on my year abroad as part of my undergraduate degree to France. And I had seen interpreters at an event in Germany before and thought, that's cool. You know, I spoke French, thought the interpreting's cool. I thought that's what I wanted to do. I didn't really know what an interpreter was. And then I went to France, at the age of 19, for my year abroad of undergraduate. And I was in a church in the far north of France, and the European Youth Conference was coming up. And someone said to me, "You speak English, don't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm from Scotland. Would you like to try interpreting?" So I think it was like 2 days before I tried interpreting as a test at their youth group. The then established interpreter thought I was good enough. And then by Friday evening, I was doing the opening night, and I did all of the French to English interpreting for that conference on my own on stage.
On stage?
The other interpreter did all the English to French. I was on stage in front of a couple of hundred young people. I think I'd interpreted like once in a city centre at a youth event before, but this was the first real, you're doing a whole conference. I got the bug then. And so I did my professional training, did my master's. But what really made me stick with it is the fact that, you know, I've done interpreting commercially. And if you interpret commercially, you're at a science conference or you're at some governmental thing, and everyone's discussing stuff and it's all very serious and professional, but often nothing seems to happen. You interpret in church and people laugh, they cry, they get healed, they have an emotional reaction to it. This time last year, I was interpreting at churches for Easter. And I think between the 4 church services that I interpreted, several hundred people gave their lives to the Lord while I was interpreting. And you think, yeah, thanks. I'll do this. Thank you very much. But the passion, you know, the passion was there fairly early when I trained as a conference interpreter so that I could interpret better in church. And what keeps me going is seeing that church interpreting, for all of its issues, for all of the decisions that people make that aren't always optimal, whenever you get interpreting in a church, something happens. And it allows churches to do things that they just couldn't do before. Now, the question then that I have in my head all the time at the moment is, how do we do that better? What is, you know, for a church of 50 people in an industrial town in the west of Scotland, what's the best way for them to think about being multilingual versus for a mega church of 20,000, what should they be looking at? There are no universal absolute solutions. It's things that you work out with each church.
That's a great story, and I can hear your passion is just seeing God use your work of interpreting to transform lives. And I am fascinated to hear your big question is, what can a church of 50 do, and how is it different than what a church of 20,000 does? What have you been stewing on with that? Are there churches of 50 that have the multilingual neighborhood that they belong to, or that have other languages in their congregation that have actually a big need for interpretation? Or are you seeing this as something that is more like God's church is multilingual, and so how do we help our churches of all shapes and sizes to reflect that?
It's a bit of both. When I was in my 20s, I was in a small charismatic church. And when I mean small, I mean like 3 families, 4 families in the west of Scotland. And one day, a bunch of refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo turn up at the church.
Wow.
They don't have any English. There were 2 people in the church who spoke French, only one of whom was trained as an interpreter. That would be me. So suddenly the church had interpreting. That lasted, I think, about 3 weeks before, for various reasons, the refugees just stopped coming.
Mm,
What I now know, which I didn't know then, is that the Sunday morning decisions are not the important decisions.
ah,
Those decisions matter. You know, what you do on a Sunday morning, that really matters. It matters whether you choose machines or humans or services in different languages and so on. But those decisions are the end product of much earlier decisions that in most cases people aren't even aware that they're making.
mm,
And so the biggest thing that I would say to churches of all sizes is your attitude and your heart matters far more than the actual tools that you use on a Sunday morning.
mhm,
If your heart is right and your attitude is right, you'll almost certainly find that the tools you choose to use are different than they would have been otherwise. But it's those attitudes that make the difference, not the tools themselves. And yes, there are differences between the tools. I have issues with certain approaches. I think certain approaches can be unhelpful precisely because they're showing an unhelpful attitude.
mm.
On top of the technical reasons, the technical differences between different tools. But what happened, I think, in that church is the church wasn't ready for the journey it was being invited to go on.
I see. That's a very profound statement there. The church wasn't ready for the journey it was being invited to go on. How did those refugees find that church and end up visiting the first time?
We don't actually know, and this has been a mystery to me how they ever found the church in the first place.
Wow.
I mean, there was a big sign out the front, but no bigger than any other sign of any other church around. I think what was interesting is for a small church, there was always a link to people who were different. It was in an area which at the time was quite a difficult area,
Mm,
and the number one problem in that area was unemployment
mm,
and poverty. I believe things have changed since, but what happens is that people will find churches in numerous ways. Now, you know, I think I built that church's website in raw HTML. So if anyone knows what it's like to build a website in HTML, that's what I did. And I'm not sure how those people found the church, but I do know that increasingly the issues that that church faced way back when, and that was an unusual thing for a church to face. Now that's a normal thing for churches in reasonably sized cities to face, especially in the United Kingdom, where refugees are being sent round the country to try and scatter them out and to try and not lay the burden too much. And I hate using this word burden, but to not make one town hold
yeah,
all the refugees or trying to scatter them around.
yeah.
And so a church could wake up in the morning. I've heard stories of churches waking up in the morning and going, "Oh, we have 2,000 refugees next door. What do we do?"
Mm, I see.
And so this isn't a we're going to have to get round to it topic, which I think it used to be.
Mhm,
It's now a topic of we have this, and what we do next is going to make a fundamental difference to the church, a fundamental difference to the community, and and this is the point that we don't like to think about. It fundamentally says something about our view of the kingdom of God.
yeah. Why don't we explore that a little bit more? What was that attitude difference that you felt like resulted in those families leaving? And what are the different attitudes that people have towards God's kingdom that you've observed from your work in this space?
So in that case, there was a difference in culture.
Mhm,
In the culture of that church was you turn up at the service on time, the time set on the front, and that's when service starts. Well, the church sent the worship leader to go and pick up the refugees, and they were from a culture where instead of clock time, they had a more relaxed attitude to time,
mhm.
and so there was I don't want to go into all the discussion and debate, but
Yeah,
really what the question was there, and the question is for every church is there such a thing as us versus them, or are we all one together? Because if there's an us versus them, then the us have a right to set the rules and to set that this is how we do church. And we then expect everyone to come into our way of doing church.
mhm.
And to an extent, that's understandable, and to an extent, there has to be a place for that. If, however, there is no such thing as us versus them, and we're all us together, then instead of it being about rule breaking, it becomes about relationship, and we say, well, what is actually going on here? We start to ask questions rather than making statements.
Mm.
We start to say, well, okay, we've noticed that you're not ready on time when people come to pick you up. What's the deal here? Is there something we can do to help, or is this a cultural thing? Should we arrange someone else to come and get you? Maybe there should be an evening service and you're better.
Mhm.
We start brainstorming solutions versus saying, well, we've set it up to run like this and we don't want to change that. And I have great respect for churches who say, we're a solid liturgical church. We start at this time, our service runs for this long. This is how we do church. And I have a lot of respect for that. But equally, I'm aware that if you suddenly get an influx of people from a different culture, that same approach, which has a lot going for it, can be a source of tension.
Mhm. Yeah, it sounds almost like just like hospitality.
Mm,
If you're postured to show hospitality, you're very attentive and will ask questions and learn and adapt. But if you're postured more as, maybe I don't know if I can use this term, but just like a club for the people who are
mm,
already members, there's no reason to try to adapt or change to
mm.
be able to include or serve anyone else. I don't know, that's just what
In,
I
in,
kinda heard, yeah.
in to an extent, so I've interpreted for mega churches, and some of the mega churches will send you a set list with strict run times because they know they have
Yep.
very expensive equipment. They've set up live streams. Now, that's fine. I'm not saying that churches should just not have any schedules and just do things whenever people feel like coming. But what I am saying is that there is a space in the kingdom of God for asking questions and saying, what is it that's a helpful approach here?
Mhm.
And how can we make this about partnership rather than we have made the rules and you will follow them?
Mm.
And also, we have to ask ourselves, how does God treat us? What's God's approach to us? And I think there is a place in theology for, yes, there are such a thing as the 10 words in the Old Testament. There is such a thing as the Old Testament law. But equally in the New Testament, you see Jesus spending a lot of time coming alongside people where they are
Yeah.
and going to them.
Mhm.
And I wonder if it's more difficult and more conflict generating to have a New Testament approach of we're going to go to you. There's a whole chapter in the book where I talk about the theology of multilingual church, and essentially it boils down to we're called to be together,
Mhm.
and if we're called to be together, we're called to work through these things together.
Let's ground that a little bit more just to help create that, that conviction for our listeners. When you say we're called to be together, what do you mean by that? And where are you seeing it in scripture? And how does that translate to the daily life of the church?
So there's a progression in the book of Acts. You start with Acts 2, where you have these Jews from all over the world come to Pentecost, and Pentecost come to Jerusalem, and Pentecost happens. Now, we don't know how many of them stayed in Jerusalem permanently. Certainly, there would have been some going back. But for the Jerusalem church, that's fine because you've just got Jews and people who have converted to Judaism. So, where you're going to have linguistic difference, since we know from Acts 2, the cultural difference is going to be relatively confined. Then you see the Ethiopian eunuch coming to know the Lord. Well, again, you have some level of cultural difference, but again, the Ethiopian eunuch was called a God-fearer. The Ethiopian eunuch had the scriptures in. More fundamentally, the Ethiopian eunuch's going back to Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Where the tension really becomes evident is in the salvation of Cornelius.
Hmm.
That's where Peter gets in a lot of trouble because Cornelius was not a Jew, although he probably had some relations with them. He was a God-fearer too. But in Acts, you have this long negotiation of what do we do with people who have come in from the outside?
Mhm.
And essentially, what the Jerusalem Council has to deal with is not purely are we going to ask these people to obey the law? If we're asking people to obey the law, it's not purely a theological issue over what's the status of the Old Testament. It's a cultural issue, it's a very practical issue. And what they find is that you're okay staying in your existing culture, and we're not going to make you become a Jew to be a Christian.
Mhm.
What that enables then is the Antioch church and other churches where you have massively multilingual churches in a single city. And so this being together part is, and we see it in Acts, and we see Paul negotiating it with in Romans and in different places where, and in Galatians especially, where we're not going to make your background of whatever kind be a wall that separates you from the rest of the church. And being together fundamentally means being in the same space together. This is why,
Mm,
despite its popularity, I have grave concerns about the paradigm of Spanish service, French service, English service.
mm,
Fundamentally, because we're not in the same space and we're not together there.
yep.
And in fact, there was some research that I came across just as I was finishing off the last draft of the book, where they researched Catholic parishes in parts of the USA and found that the only ones who managed to stabilize and grow in multilingual communities were the ones who had bilingual liturgy. When they
Mm,
had Spanish Mass, English Mass, there was no integration between the two. When they're saying, no, we're going to have Mass in Spanish and English, guess what? The people started getting to know each other, they started having joint leadership and so on. Being in the same space matters more than we could possibly imagine.
mhm.
Because when we're in the same space, we're going to get to know each other, we're going to get to meet each other, we're going to do tea and coffee together and so on. That physical presence really matters.
Yeah. That's amazing. One phrase stood out for me though. What you said, you said massively multilingual churches, MMCs.
Mm.
I just like that phrase because in our kind of techie world right now, LLMs are all the rage, large language models. So massively multilingual churches. That's pretty awesome.
Well,
And
yeah, I want to put a qualified on that a church isn't multilingual because it's got people who speak different languages in it. A church is multilingual where no matter which language you speak, you can serve and you can be discipled and you can grow and you can bring your gifts to the table. And no one's going to hold you back and say, you got to wait until you speak English. That's what multilingual church is.
yeah. Do you have that in your book? Do you outline maybe that journey of like you might start here where all that's possible is really just, you know, translation of a service or something like that, but you're to be multilingual, it means that people can actually serve side by side, belong to that community, worship together. Like, do you have that journey mapped out in your book?
There is no such thing as a map of that journey, sadly. I walk through some of the common approaches that people can take. So, oh, they're all going to speak English anyway, why bother? Or let's do services in different languages, let's throw some different language. And I walk through those different approaches,
Mhm.
but I didn't want to tell churches how to do this.
Mm.
I did want to give them the pros and cons of all the tools that are available. I didn't want to tell them, and it's very rare for me to say don't use a tool. It tends to be for certain purposes, this tool is less than ideal because.
Mhm.
But then what I do is in the last in the second last section of the book, I turn it over to the churches and invite them to walk the journey as a church
Mhm.
and with other churches going the same way. And the reality is, some churches are going to choose that they really, really want a bilingual service where you're singing songs in two languages and praying, and
Yep.
that's fine. Other churches are going to say, well, what we really need is we really need some words on a screen or on a phone that people can read while they're listening. And I'm not here to say to churches, you have to do it this way.
Yeah.
I'm here to ask the questions to fundamentally ask where the church is trying to go, who the church is, where they're trying to go, and then to walk through the journey of whatever you do, do it well,
Mm.
knowing that there are no perfect solutions,
Mhm.
and knowing that to an extent every solution has to be an interim solution that you're probably going to have to adapt to your needs.
Mhm. So you've helped many churches to think these things through, and I think on your website you're also offering consulting. Is that the kind of consulting service you're providing? Is
Yeah,
to help a
so
church think through
so
this?
consulting has been available kind of quietly for a while. Consulting is now fully available. It wasn't fully available before. Mostly my work previously has been in delivering the interpreting and researching on on church
Space.
interpreting and latterly on multilingual church.
Okay. Okay.
So I come at this as a researcher and as a practitioner, and then I'm available to churches to say, I think I said to a church recently, as a consultant, and I'm happy to work with churches as a consultant. My main job is I know where the potholes in the road are because I've read so many case studies and I've come across so many and I've interpreted in different places.
Mhm.
And I've also been a consultant interpreter in the commercial world. I know where the potholes are.
Mhm.
And if all I do to some churches is just pull them round the road a bit so they don't fall into the pothole, I've done my job. But
Mm.
my second book was on machine interpreting and what it meant for professionals. So I don't know the finer points of the exact test, but I know how those systems work.
Mhm.
I know how they are sold, and so all of this, the technology piece, I've already got both as an interpreter and as a researcher, and now consulting is completely available for churches. I do a 6 month package, a 1 year package, and it's a case of here's someone who's read it all, who's experienced a good chunk, who's experienced a chunk of it, who knows what it's like to interpret, who knows the strengths and weaknesses of these solutions. Right. Just having someone that you can bounce stuff off and who can ask you awkward questions is going to
Mhm.
help set you on a useful road for your church.
I mean, I think that's a very valuable service. If you don't know already, and I think that maybe you knew a little bit from the podcast the previous podcast episodes, we do provide a platform for translation interpretation for churches called
Mhm.
Spiffio. We're building this, and we've built it for many years now. But we try to build it kind of with your philosophy without ever having met you. We call it all in one because we try to offer different ways that a church can use it that they can adapt for their context. So one of those ways is you can stream just the interpreter's voice into people's phones, right? So you can use a human
Mhm.
interpreter. Another option is you can use AI with a human in a loop that can make corrections to the real-time captioning before it goes out to get better quality. Another one is if a pastor manuscripts, you can release a translation to their manuscript in real time as they're preaching to get the highest level of
Mhm.
accuracy that you could desire. And the automatic translations could be human reviewed even before they go out. And then they can be read aloud by an AI, or you can record a person's voice that's reading it. So we tried to provide these solutions, and also slide translation and other elements that kind of get overlooked because it's usually focused on just the speech part. Try to give churches the tools that they can pick from to create the experience that they wanted to create. What I'm kind of curious in hearing about your questions and those potholes and stuff like that that you help navigate them through. How do you actually help them arrive at the solution that they end up choosing? Like, because I think that there's a couple defaults, but it feels like because of your view into the whole space, what are some of those potholes, and how do you kind of get them to like, oh, you might not want to do this, and this is kind of maybe where you want to go. What's an example if you were to case study, maybe even me or
So
something like that?
I'm actually working on early clients just now, and the first thing that I said to a test client was my job is to hide the complexity of all of the table full of solutions. And by understanding the identity of the church, the size of the church, and yes, I hate to say it, the church's budget,
Yeah.
I can eliminate like 90% of the solutions. They
Mm.
don't even need to know that a bunch of these exist because, and again, I'm not telling them what to do. I'm still going to give them a menu of two or three things that they can look at.
Hmm.
But the other 20 or 30 and all the variants thereof, how many variants of machine interpreting are there? It's just crazy now. All these variants, I can just sweep that under the carpet because it's not relevant for them.
Mm.
And so, but also with things like the number one thing that I've seen with my interpreting clients, and I've seen just in talking to pastors already, is the assumption that every tool can do every job well.
Hmm.
So there are some things that machine interpreting is fantastic at, and I think it's slightly better adapted to putting text on a screen than human interpreters are.
Yep.
There's a new variation of human interpreting that allows interpreters to do that, but it tells you something when master's level trained interpreters need extra training to be able to offer that service.
Hmm.
So machine interpreting is more naturally adapted to that. But if you have, for example, a preacher who loves to preach with emotion and lots of intonation and lots of body language, machine interpreting is not a good solution.
Hmm.
Precisely because, and you'll know this as well as anyone else, most machine interpreting is still based on what's called the cascade model. You get voice recognition, you run it through machine translation, and then you spit out voice synth at the other end, voice synthesis at the other end. For some tasks, that's wonderful. For any tasks that require cultural sensitivity, or I hate to use the word performance, no, it's
Mm.
not going to cut it. And even for any task that needs to check that people have understood, no, you can't. It just won't. So the expectation that every tool is equally good at every job is one of the big potholes, and it's why my job as a consultant is going to be hiding a lot of this stuff and going, you don't need to know about this. If what you really want is you want to make a big deal of the two languages, you want to foreground that in your church, and you've got two languages, chuck an interpreter on stage,
Mm,
or put them in the booth and mention them. The purpose determines the tools, and if the tools aren't aligned with that purpose, just forget they even exist.
mhm,
What it does mean is that I need to know all the tools really well, and I need to keep up to date with what they can and can't do. And there's a new way of looking at machine interpreting, which I'm still working on fully understanding. But I need to know this stuff mostly so that I don't need to tell people. And the biggest pothole that I've seen in the literature, and it's one that I'm aware of, has happened. Certainly, it happened in the church I was in. Assuming that if I use the right tool, I'll get the right results. No, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
The tool is like decision number six. There's a whole load of decisions you need to get before you go, do I use machine interpreting or do I use humans? It's like, well, yeah, let's walk to that. And I was chatting to a potential church client recently saying, I'm not even going to talk about tools. In the 6 month package, I'm not even going to talk to you about tools for 3 months because you don't need, you
Mm.
know, you need a few months of where are we, what are we doing, who are we, what we're trying to achieve. And once you've done that, the tool selection becomes so much easier.
It makes obvious, very obvious at that point. Yeah. What when churches for those potential clients, for those clients, what prompts them to reach out to you in the first place? What prompts them to find you, to reach out to you, and to ask for your help?
It was interesting. I've got a webinar on YouTube that I was asked to do by a parachurch organization. And what prompted them is the church is going, help, we need to do something about this and we don't know what to do.
Mm,
And that was very basically a tools webinar with a bit of, think about strategy at the end. And I think there's an awareness amongst churches, this is not their natural turf. And those of us who've been in the sector, I spent 6 years on the board of my national professional association. This sector is home turf for me. It's not, this has been my life since 2008. Big
yeah.
deal. It's not, the terminology is fine. Whereas if I talk to churches about source text, target text, they're like, what? And so it's
Mm,
having someone who's can wade through all of that and serve it up into something understandable. I think a lot of churches now are just going, we want to do something, but we don't know what.
hmm.
I was going to say that's where that webinar came from, and I think that's where the consulting is going to come from as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That sounds like a fantastic webinar. Do you think that the majority of churches reaching out to you, are they actually focused on bilingual, like serving one language, or are they thinking multilingual?
I'm seeing some interest amongst what we would call migrant churches.
Mm,
So churches where their first language is not the what I call the locally dominant language.
yeah.
Most of my professional interpreting for churches has been for what we would call massively multilingual churches, the
Mm,
mega churches. It'll be interesting to see where the future consulting clients come from. I have a feeling, knowing what I know about demographics, that there's going to be a real mix. But the people who are suddenly going, this is now on our radar at the moment, often seem to be migrant churches.
I see.
And I think that raises all sorts of questions as well. Um, this isn't the place for it, but there is a big discussion to be had in church life about power and authority and
Yeah.
decision making. And there's a line in the book which I'm glad I wrote, but I think is going to get me into trouble, where I say the people who don't need the language services are not the people who know enough to make good decisions about which language services are needed.
I don't see why you get in trouble. That makes so much sense.
But as soon as you say that, people start going, well, how do we? Okay, now we need to talk about leadership structures. But it's the classic thing: is it's the people who don't need the interpreters who book them and then go, huh, what? Um, that's true in the commercial world, and it's true everywhere, and it's true because of long term issues with power and decision making and so on.
In some ways, it sounds like it rhymes with Acts, right? Where the apostles established the deacons
mhm.
who actually spoke the language of the Hellenistic widows, the widows who didn't speak Hebrew, so that they could get an equal serving in
Mm.
the ministry of the church and getting their food provided for and things like that. They had to end up kind of sharing power and elevating people who could actually directly minister to that group effectively
Mm.
without that bias. So it's just, I mean, the rhyming
Yeah.
aspect of that with history and the history of the church is just really really fascinating to me.
I think
Um,
also that the deacons bring up another point, which is I am now very hot on telling churches the experience should be comparable no matter which language you speak.
mm,
It should be as close to identical as you can possibly manage. And I'm concerned from what I've read and heard in places that often without meaning to those who speak the locally dominant language get the family dinner. Those who speak different languages get left the crumbs.
mm,
And this is, I think that's a long term thinking that needs to be looked at. I think it's also, as much as anything, it's a heart attitude.
mhm.
I'm just finishing an article for my Substack talking about effort, in saying that if you want to know how much you love someone, you ask how much effort are you ready to put into that relationship. And effort looks different to different people and in different circumstances. But any time that our default is what's the quickest, easiest, cheapest solution,
Yeah,
whichever solution we pick is automatically the wrong
yeah. When it comes to people and relationships,
one.
it definitely devalues them. Yeah.
I spoke to one church leader who said, machine interpreting was their solution because they didn't have anyone who could do the interpreting, and they still needed to reach these people. And I'm like, fine. And I
Mhm,
heard of another church where the people who speak the other languages want to read on their phones or on their devices while they're hearing English. And again, we've just said machine interpreting does that more naturally than human interpreters do, although it's
mhm.
perfectly feasible for human interpreters to provide that for you. But if it becomes we're going to do that because it's easy and we don't want to think very hard about it. It's one thing to do that because you've thought about it and this is the right solution for you. There are safeguards that you really should put in place. It's another thing to say we've chosen that because it's available and it's free and we can just roll it out without much thought.
Yeah, that's not
That's not the same conversation whatsoever.
no, not at all. And I find that, because a church is an organization, you can have different levels of buy-in at different levels of
Mm,
leadership, and if you don't get the leadership aligned in terms of the attitude, and the purpose, then that's how oftentimes you end up with those kinds of situations that it's like, well, this is cheap and easy. Let's just turn this thing on and like, okay, we did it. Like, we have something. Um, but it is difficult because what I've encountered myself is just that people are in different places in terms of their passion for it or their understanding of what needs to happen and the questions. What have you seen in terms of helping churches to, like, as an organization to navigate that so that they have the alignment? Like, we've seen cases where a church initially is really excited because of, like, "Oh, yeah, we have a bunch of refugees showing up." And then, but then that's it. They just wanna, like, turn on a solution and then just, like, kind of like, that's it. And then when the refugees leave, kind of like what you experienced, it's just like, "Oh, okay, let's just turn it off now." Like, it's like the identity, the purpose, the vision, and stuff like that was really, what's the word? Contingent. It was just like, okay, there's some people here, so we need something, and then okay, they're gone. All right. Uh, like that's not very far along in that journey yet. So like, what? Tell me, what have you
So
seen?
I use a matrix that I developed in my PhD where I map churches according to how much they think they need language services. And the reality doesn't matter, it's what they think that matters.
That's
And
right.
I've explained this to professionals so often about clients, and they're like, what do you mean the reality doesn't matter? It's like the reality doesn't matter, it's what people think that matters. So their perceived need on one axis and the perceived value for their mission and vision on the other. In fact, perceived value almost can be synonymous with how central it is to the life and the vision of the church.
Yes.
So when you have low perceived value and low perceived need, you get nothing, basically. Turns out that's not quite fully the case always, but you get something that's half-hearted at best, and it's just let's do something.
Hmm.
When you get the interesting one is when you get high perceived need. So they realize they need it, but it's not central to the church. You get what I've called incidental interpreting, which you've just made, which is the language services are purely contingent on the perceived operational needs right now.
Mhm.
That in that form, there's all sorts of weird, interesting expectations you get on interpreters and on services and views of languages that come with that. But realistically, because it's not central to the church, there's going to be no follow up.
Mm.
So they could book like the most expensive, and there are professional church interpreters. I'm one of them. They could book the most expensive professional and church interpreters in the world, and the results would be almost identical to if they'd used the machine.
Ah.
Because the interpreting itself could be of the greatest quality, but if there's no discipleship, if there's no follow up, if there's no, there's a chapter in my book called, I think it's called something like "It's Not Just Sunday Services."
Mhm.
If there's no work after Sunday, well, you're not going to get lasting fruit.
Mhm.
The other weird side of the equation is you get churches who have a real vision for this, they have a real mission for it, but they don't need it right now. And there's a wonderful case in research written by a lady called Jennifer Raymond who looked at this church. No, sorry, Cecile Vigouroux, who looked at this church in South Africa,
Mhm.
which everyone in the church spoke French and Lingala, but they had interpreting into English.
Mm.
But no one in the church spoke English. The interpreters spoke English, but no one else did. And because there was no actual need for it, if you needed the English, the interpreting made no sense.
The interpreting made no sense?
The interpreting made no sense because the interpreter ended up becoming like a double act with the preacher.
Oh.
So it was a symbol of what the church intended, but not useful for the purpose that they thought they had for it because there was no actual need at the moment.
Yeah.
When you have high perceived need and high perceived value, you get what's called integral interpreting. An integral view of languages. The classic case there is Centrum Lebendiges Forte Church in Bonn, Germany, that's still multilingual. They've planted a multilingual church.
Mm.
Everything they do is predicated on being multilingual to the point where they are happy to delve into the cultural conflicts and to work
Yes.
through these cultural conflicts. Because if you're multilingual by design and by identity, you accept that's what's going to happen.
Mhm.
And there's a line in the book from Pastor Mario Van Schaffer, one of the founding pastors of the church, who said, "We've gone past the paradigm of we are here to help the poor internationals. And now we say to them, we can't achieve our vision without you." And there's like 4 pages in the book where I deconstruct that quote into what that means. But when you get to there,
Yep.
you're going to see far more lasting fruit. You're going to get a whole lot more trouble than you would anywhere else. But you're going to see far more lasting fruit because realistically, that's. I say this as a research with my research ahead very much on. That's the only one that works.
Mhm.
Long term, nothing. And we're still waiting on the data to absolutely prove that. But if you know enough about interpreting, if you've been around language services for any length of time,
Yep.
if you've been around interpreting for churches for like more than a week, you can see very quickly that the integral position is the only one that actually works long term.
Yep.
Some churches go straight there. Some churches have this long and winding road, and I could see people in my PhD who were kind of crawling up to that view.
Yep.
But that's where you've got to get to, and you need buy-in not just from the senior leadership, of course. You need buy-in from the house group leadership, from the kids leadership. You need buy-in from the worship leaders.
Yep.
This has to be who the church is.
Yes.
That often doesn't get you often don't get there overnight.
It truly does transform the whole church, and, I guess the church has to be willing to undergo that transformation as a body.
Mm,
Like, and I think that, to me, like, even, like, your subtitle for your book, "Strategies for Making Disciples in All Languages," I've found that cross-cultural interaction, that intercultural interaction is discipleship because it forces
mm,
us to question so many assumptions that we have. It forces us to live with the discomfort of learning to love our neighbor who is very different from us. It's forcing us to, like, drop our guard and be like, "Huh, I'm gonna let myself be affected by this other culture, by this other person." And it's just so much discipleship happens in that versus the monocultural, monolingual bubble where we got this together. We know what to do. We got our values. We know what's right, and we're just gonna like double down on these, and we're gonna be good. Like That's there's no room for discipleship in there. It's like we already figured it out. Like just have to become
We're
like
not
us.
honest. Well, the classic case, and I come from the discipline of interpreting studies where we think we know how this stuff works. Or
Mm.
rather, when you do your PhD, you're going to break an existing theory. The field's 50 years old. Actually, 70 years old now. The field's
Oh
like
wow.
70 years old. You're going to break something, just set up something for someone else to break. But we think we know how interpreting works. Then I read the research coming out of the US on multi ethnic church.
Mhm.
And I found some really lovely cases of like churches that were on the verge of splitting because people came to the fellowship meal and they brought food from their culture.
Wow.
And so there was one church that came to this situation of, people are getting worried over food. We're just going to give them generic food, our fellowship meals. Generic food was generic US food. So there's an
Mm.
assumption there that our culture is generic and everyone else is exotic. When and so the what I've been writing against them, I'm working on an article at the moment, kind of poking at this, is that in the multi-ethnic church space, often there's an assumption that what we're trying to do is welcome people into our church
Yeah.
and we're trying to make them become part of us.
Yeah.
And so there's this tension of, how long should we allow people to be in home groups in their own language so that they don't create a clique? Well, you probably already have cliques in your church. You almost certainly have people, if your
Absolutely.
church is more than like 100 people, you probably have cliques. So can we have the same concern for the cliques that you already have, please? But beyond that, I think my concern is that in multi ethnic church, some of the discussion was how do we make those people integrate rather than how do we all become one church together?
Mhm.
And it's the biggest criticism that I'm going to level at the multi ethnic church research is that with the exception of the large scale surveys, the questions that people have been asking, for me, fundamentally have been the wrong questions. It's not about making them more like us. It's like all of us becoming more like Jesus.
Yeah. So it's not cultural assimilation. It is cultural integration or something where we need one another to become like Christ. And without the other, we actually are just going after a mirage.
And I think the understanding that there's no such thing as default language, there's no such thing as default culture.
Mm.
I was listening to one of your earlier episodes where someone was kind of talking about how great your product is, which is fantastic to hear. And he says near the end of the episode, he said, we're talking about one day having a flip service where it's the English speakers who have to rely on the technology.
Mhm.
And I'm like, yes, that's actually, I've been suggesting it and I've suggested it to a few pastors and they've looked at me like, and we knew you were weird, but we didn't know you were quite that weird.
That weird.
And it's like, no, but so this is good church theology of how does Jesus expect us to live? And how did Jesus live? And I know the theologians could debate over, I think it's Philippians 2, where it talks about he emptied himself until the cows come home. But if we follow a savior who laid down his position
Mhm.
and came to earth, who, however we want to define emptied himself, that I think it's kenosis, however we want to define that, Jesus went way beyond the basics and way beyond the minimum
Yeah.
to save us. And in every theological background, they would say he took our place. Well, how much more incarnational can church get than those who already have the power saying, uh, I'm not asking people to do this every week. Or
Mhm.
maybe they should be, but how much more incarnational can we be than to say, for a defined period, maybe it's one Sunday a year, maybe it's one Sunday a quarter or something, or maybe we just allow someone to preach in another language one week, that we step down from being the default
Mhm.
and we become the people who need the services. Because I guarantee you, if we have a Sunday where we have to rely on Spiffy or an interpreter, or it's bilingual liturgy, but the person speaking on stage isn't speaking our language, I guarantee you would make better decisions because suddenly we would go, oh, it's really awkward to have a headset on for like an hour and a half. Oh, right. What do we need to do about that? Or, hold on, I can hear the interpreter struggling with the person speaking so quickly. Oh, when I speak quickly, oh,
Mhm. Empathy.
ah, yeah. It's the most uncomfortable thing for a professional interpreter is being the person who needs the interpreters. It really hurts. I mean, like I've had it 3 or 4 times now, and trust me, it's not fun. Because
My church
suddenly now I'm aware of all the things that I have to do right for the people who need me.
That's true. It's hard. I've done interpretation not as a professional, but I grew up in an Indonesian church, and people loved it because I can interpret well into English, but not into Indonesian. But they loved the performative aspect of it and things like that. But eventually, I was like, it wasn't sustainable, and I knew from interpreting different people, it's just like it can get tricky because you're not really. Sometimes they're not sure what they're saying, and so you're not sure what you're saying. uh,
We have tools that I'm not allowed to admit to in public, but we have things. So, becoming a professional interpreter, a lot of it is picking up the tools and the techniques and things that we would never do, most of them because our tutors scare us away from doing them. But we have a bag of stuff that we know how to use.
mhm,
And even something basic like when I was studying CLW for my PhD, they asked if I could go to their interpreters meeting. I was like, sure. And there's, could you talk through some basic stuff that professional interpreters do that might help? And the first question I asked was, is anyone tired after interpreting a church service? There was it's like, yeah, we know why. And I was able to explain that as a professional, I'm taught to avoid as far as possible interpreting word for word.
mhm.
We are trained to, and to an certain extent, drilled to interpret idea by idea and to find the natural way of saying that in the other language, especially when you're working simultaneously, because
Yep.
you don't have a choice. I mean, I work between French and English that are relatively grammatically similar, but even still, there are certain things that work great in English that in French I'm going to be going, "Ugh,
Mhm.
okay, let me see. But you learn then, you get taught and you learn ways of dealing with that. Number one question I get is, what do you do when you don't know the word? It's like, well, one, if I'm at home, I have tools that help me. And two, if I'm on my game, I don't need to know the word
Yep.
because I can talk around it if I have to.
Yep.
It's like, it's no problem. There are some very specific terms where you really need to know the word. For everything else, we have ways.
And I think that let's tie this in. Well, I wanted to mention real quick. My church was one of the weird ones. They let me preach in Indonesian to a majority, like the dominant local language is English, and we were shocked. We used Biffio, so we showed the translation on the screen. But people actually were. I was surprised. People were actually very engaged, and they received the message in a different way because of it. And also, in composing the sermon, I wrote it in Indonesian, not in English. So it just touches so differently on the kind of the cultural norms and stuff that I'm going off of, like the analogies, the feelings, the emotions. They came from a very different part of me than the English thinking side. I would say. I think that Indonesian is not my heart language, but it was my home language when I grew up. And so it has so much more, it's so much more accessible in some ways of like Chris as just a person, not Chris as the one who went to school and did all this stuff and worked here and everything like that. It felt so different, but the message could hit people in the heart in a different way than if I just spoke in English. And people actually got it, and they wanted to do it again. I just didn't want to go do it do it too often. But I love your idea about setting aside a Sunday. Maybe Pentecost Sunday would be ideal or something, but any
Mhm.
Sunday where that flipping the script can happen and where people can experience what it's like to be on the other side of that translation and interpretation. And it creates that shared sense of belonging and identity that this is who we are as a church, everybody.
And I think also something that I think churches don't reflect on enough is that your capability today is not going to be your capability tomorrow.
Mm,
So I've heard churches say, we use machine interpreting primarily because we don't have any interpreters. And it's like, okay, fine.
hmm
Within a certain space of time, you will have candidates. Now, one of the things I'm exploring is what's the right way to assess the capability of interpreters when they haven't gone through, master's level education that's supposed to prepare you to interpret for the UN.
hmm
What would I assess? And even like the way they assess in university is not the way that our clients assess us.
mm,
And it's certainly not the way you'd be assessed in church.
hmm
And
Yeah.
so now the puzzle for me, and it's not quite a research project, it's more of a thinking project, is how would I want to assess church interpreters? What would I look for assuming that they don't have the memberships and the stuff that professionals do, what do you need?
Yeah.
And then, at what point would I say to churches, actually, it's worth looking at training people up? And what I posed a question, I know some of the top conference interpreter trainers in the world because I've talked to them and been to conferences.
Yeah.
And I said to them, if you got one day and the people, it wasn't just one language, it's like 6 or 8 languages, which is likely to be with churches if you get loads of interpreter candidates together. And I said to them, if you have one day, what would you do? And both of them said, well, the first thing I'd do would be to ask for 7. I was like, no. If you have one day, and I got from these 2 trainers the kind of basic level approach that they would want people to take. And I realized actually they are, I mean, I now have a toolkit that I would love to get the opportunity to try with training interpreters. But the point of my intervention was that, a church should be saying, we're going to use this today. But for the discipleship of our community, for the raising up of leaders, for the future where we want to do even more, having some people who know what they're doing with interpreting is actually really useful no matter what solution we're going to be doing.
Absolutely.
Have some people, there's ways that interpreters think that are so different to the ways, a running joke that I put on Twitter now is getting opinions on monolinguals on translation and interpreting is like getting marriage opinions from a monk. They probably know the theory, but the practice ain't there. But when people learn to think like an interpreter, like I preach differently now because I think like an interpreter.
Yes. Mhm.
I would love the opportunity to preach in French. I think it'd be a really interesting thing. But I now think differently about communication because I've been in meetings and it's like, I don't think these people know what they're saying either. How do I communicate when I was in one meeting? I came out of a 9-hour AGM, 8 of us interpreters, and I said to one of my colleagues, I said, did you have a clue what was going on? But it's life.
What's AGM? What's AGM?
An annual general meeting.
Oh, okay.
So organizations here have to have like general meetings every
Yep.
year.
Yep. A general assembly.
And it's like, we'll interpret and we'll do our best, but there's interpreting where you understand what's happening. Like in church interpreting, I know exactly what's happening. I can, you'll know as well, if you interpret sermons, you can sometimes predict where the preacher's going before they even get there because you know how this thing works.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it takes time to build up that sensibility as an interpreter, but to help people think like an interpreter, think like, how does a sermon work? How does a praise song work? How do the announcements work? Why can I not use the same technique to interpret the announcements than I can to interpret the sermon?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could give you the technical linguistics, or I could teach you interpreting skills and you could find out for yourself, oh, I have to lengthen the gap between them talking and me speaking. Oh, or I have to shorten it, or I have to summarize, but I can't summarize the announcements because it matters that it's 9 p.m. on Wednesday
Yep.
and not sometime on Wednesday.
Yep.
But during the sermon, I can totally summarize chunks because not every tiny detail needs to get across every time.
That's right.
But with the announcements, you better not summarize because people will know.
Yep. I think that's fascinating because the details of interpretation that you're describing, they demonstrate interpretation as an art form. Right? And then I think machine interpretation is not really imitating that art, although people are going to train AI models to try to do that. But they really are more of a utility. Like utility is just like a means to an end to do something. But interpretation, what you're describing, is like an art form. It really is. And the same with beauty when it's done amazingly, right?
So the difference with machine interpreting tells you what the person said. Human interpreting gives you what they meant and how they said it. And so I've said in the book, for people greeting people on the door, they should probably have a machine interpreting module on them. Especially the newer ones that auto-detect language. I don't know how they do that. I know someone who's written the algorithms for detecting language.
Yeah.
But like in a few sentences, Google Translate can tell you which language you're speaking. That's I like that. That's impressive. And so conversations on the door, where are the toilets on? Go for it. If the emphasis is on something else but the semantics of what was said, then we need to look at some other solution. And I like the idea of post-edited machine interpreting I actually predicted that about 6 months ago, so I'm really glad you're doing it because I didn't know if anyone was doing it yet. But that's a thing, and that's going to allow some shifts that wouldn't otherwise be there. The other flip side is post edited machine translation. So I don't think we've ever said, okay, interpreting is spoken or signed and happens in the moment, translation is written and happens afterwards.
Hmm.
For those of you who don't know that, I think we need to clarify that. Um, Post edited machine translation and all of the computer aided translation tools that it's embedded into have created a spot where the very best human translators work as they always did.
Hmm.
Those who are getting there tend to be less likely to reformulate in the way that they would otherwise. So they will take the sentence breaks in what we call the source text, so the original text,
Yep.
and they will keep those sentence breaks where they are in their translation because that's how the software segments.
Yes.
With post edited machine interpreting, most of the hard work of human interpreting is the reformulation step.
Hmm.
So the question that we have then is how do we either just accept that's a price of the technology, and so we're not going to have summarizing, or we're not going to have the performative aspect of interpreting, and that's feasible, theoretically feasible. In terms of how we now understand human interpreting, we would have to talk in terms of gains and losses. What are you gaining with that? What are you losing? Or do we look at the technology and go, we've learned from machine translation where they had this segmentation restriction, which is
Hmm.
what we would call it. How do we remove that in interpreting, especially at speed? Because interpreting, I like to joke with my translation colleagues and say, I interpret in one half an hour shift because we usually take turns every half an hour.
Yeah,
I interpret in half an hour what they translate in a day.
that's right.
So the
It's
speed
ridiculous. The
totally
volume is
different.
so different. The volume is so different.
I mean, where interpreting technology is going just now, the other end of it is computer aided interpreting, where the machine is extracting the terms for me and checking my term bases. I haven't used the software yet, but I've seen colleagues who love it. In church, if you can get computer aided interpreting that extracts a Bible verse and following preset rules selects a correct translation and throws that on the screen so I don't have to do a last minute Bible gateway search,
Hmm.
I will be very happy.
Oh, we can build that. We should build that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in French, there are two or three main translations. I have an algorithm in my head for which one I use.
Yeah.
It would be easy enough to say the equivalent of King James, NASB, RSV is Louis II. So if they're quoting from this translation, you fetch me that one.
Hmm.
Those kind of things, that's where the technology can really, really help and could revolutionize church interpreting because it saves my brain space.
Mm.
And also doing things like, well, if they've just used a word from that passage, I should probably use the word that's used in that French translation. I can do that myself because I've got a two-screen setup here. But if the technology can all detect, oh, he's used the word anointing, that's in that translation they use onction, oh, he must be quoting from that passage. Again, flashing terminology up on the screen in a sensitive way, that's going to save, and that saves a lot of hassle. And in the best possible world, it lets me concentrate on the performance stuff that I should be concentrating on anyway.
Mm. That's a great idea, and I hopefully we can try that out with you. We can pilot that with you, perhaps, or some of your other interpreters that you work with. I
Yeah.
think that if you give me a moment, I'm just gonna like tie it in now because it is a theology of technology
Mm.
podcast, and so we've talked a lot about more of the interpretation side, the theology side, the church side, and now we arrive at I guess that sixth step that you said earlier, which is picking your technology. And I think with Spiffio, our dream was to kind of create the tools that let the churches have a pathway for that because you could start a machine interpreting as you get a person who is qualified to interpret they can naturally transition to the same platform to be providing that language interpretation with their voice, right? Like streaming the audio basically to people's phones. And then we can also enhance the experience by enabling you to translate the slides or the worship songs, even. We're using LLMs to generate a singable translation of a worship song, but you can still have a human edit it. So it's not
Mhm.
trying to do it like, just real time live on the fly. That's not possible. But if you have a translator interpreter, that saves so much of the effort of trying to get it to fit in a way that could be sung by giving you a first pass that can be sung. And so it's just trying to enhance it so that the whole experience of church could be multilingual. And we also created a product for Convo, for conversations, that's more designed for that in-person discipleship, where it's more of a casual setting. It's more of just like, I just need a way to talk to you around the fellowship table where we're going to eat a meal or something like that. So we're looking at all those parts of the experience, and seeing how can technology assist to support the church and living into this multilingual identity. Now, I want to hear from you, kind of with everything that you've shared. What When it comes to the technology, in the beginning of our conversation, you said that the technology can actually reveal something about your attitude, right?
Mhm.
I would love to hear more about that. Is that what uses of technology? We've talked about some. Do you see revealing the attitude of Christ through its use?
So there's a big difference here between technology as assistance and technology as replacement.
Okay.
So the best machines in the world do not do the same job as learning the language. So if we say, for example, like if for example, you had a church with a lot of Polish people in, for me, the long-term end game has to be more of the English speakers in the church learning Polish.
Mm,
Use the tools as much as you can, and please do use them as assistants. And I say this even about interpreting. Use the assistants as available. Technology as assistants is entirely theologically usable. I pointed out someone, people were going crazy during COVID about, can you do church online? And I said, well, wait a minute. About two-thirds of the New Testament we get because Paul used the technology of the Roman Empire postal service.
mhm,
It's totally okay to use technology. We have books because they were invented by traveling evangelists who wanted to carry the Bible around in a smaller form. That's where books come from.
mhm.
The church literally invented the book. So, or the codex, which became the book.
Yeah.
So, technology as assistance, perfectly okay. And that can reveal an attitude of we want to do something to reach these people and we're aware of our current limitations and we want to go past them. Cool, great, go for it. Where technology becomes a problem is when it becomes technology as replacement. The big question is who are we expecting to carry the weight? So we know from recent research that having a conversation with machine interpreting is qualitatively a different thing than having a conversation just in a normal language or even with an interpreter. So there's a lovely recent story from using machine interpreting in medical settings, and my medical interpreting colleagues straight away go, "Why are they doing it?" Or, they're going to do it. When doctors and patients use, say, Google Translate or Microsoft Translate, or even a specifically made system to talk to each other, they change how they do the talking.
Mm,
So if we know that, we know that the technology, the conversational interpreting technology, is going to help us have a form of conversation. But if we want a full conversation, we better get learning the language.
mhm.
We can't say we have the technology, that's all we need to do. That's technology as replacement, where we say we've got the tech, we've done our bit, cool. And forgetting that listening to a machine interpret is different to listening to a human. Reading words on stage is different to hearing the sermon in your language. So this is the attitude shift of technology as assistance is we're going to use every tool in the toolbox because we care about you and we want to grow more like Christ together.
Mhm.
Technology as replacement is we've got this magic box that does some stuff that we don't quite understand that we'll just use so that we can say we're doing something. And that's that's as simple as it gets is are you using it to help you or are you using it to replace effort?
Yeah. And to
And
replace, like, the real conversations between people. Like,
yeah,
your
to do
analogy
the hard
about the
work.
yeah, the written word reminded me of, like, I think some of the letters of 1st or 2nd, 3rd John. He says that, "I'd rather see you face to face, but I'm writing this letter for now." And, it's just interesting that, this thing that we take for granted, the written word, actually is a technology, like you pointed out, and then
Mm,
the Roman postal system, is also part of that technology. But the preference of the biblical author was, "I really would love to see you face to face." And it's kinda like that
mm.
with translation. I really would love to just have a conversation with you where we understood each other. More like perhaps depending on how you interpret Pentecost, the speaking in tongues, because people heard them in their own language. They could have a actual conversation. But the technology is this assistant that is widely used throughout Scripture, to help bridge that until we get the full reality.
And
So,
it's like
yeah.
my preference is always to interpret in the room. But if
Mm,
I do church interpreting in the room, I have to, any church I would do interpreting in the room for means I have to miss the Sunday service of my church.
yeah.
I don't like that because I like my church.
Ah,
Whereas if I'm interpreting remotely, and I don't know if Spiffio does remote interpreting yet, but
I do,
if I
yeah.
work for a mega church with a remote interpreting platform, I go to my church service, chat to the people that I know, come home, have lunch, and then I interpret while my wife's making dinner, which is pretty cool. My preference is to be in the room. I personally think, and there's some data to suggest that interpreters interpret better in the room.
Yeah.
But if I can assist the church, 5,000 miles away in either direction because of time zones,
Mhm.
who wouldn't have access to professional level interpreting otherwise, I'm not going to go, oh, really sorry, I've got to be there.
Mhm.
What? No, I'm going to assist. And then I get the joy of, uh, over Easter, I interpreted for 4 different church services for 2 different churches and got to see, I think, well over 100 people give their lives to the Lord. That's a pretty good Easter.
That's
And I
a
still got to go to the Sunday service on Easter Sunday morning. Is
Mhm. You
you
got
know,
everything.
yeah, I got the whole lot. I was exhausted. I mean, I was absolutely exhausted by the end of it. But this is the technology allows you to do stuff that you wouldn't otherwise do, but it shouldn't replace the things that you should actually be doing.
That's a good word. Well, Dr. Jonathan Downey, thank you so much for joining me today on the TheoTech podcast. It was a lengthy and illuminating conversation, and I hope that we can have many more of these in the future. It's so encouraging for me to have a
Mm.
partner in the gospel side by side working for us living fully into who Christ called us to be. The church is multilingual. And so it's like, this is amazing that we get to labor in this harvest and work together towards this goal. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of the TheoTech podcast, and a big thanks to Dr. Jonathan Downey for joining us and sharing his insights with us. I'd also like to mention our patrons who make these episodes possible. And if you'd like to support the storytelling around the theology of technology, you can do so at patreon.com/theotech. Lastly, I'd like to mention that Spiffio is a sponsor for this episode. Spiffio is an all-in-one platform for translation and accessibility, and we help churches create belonging across languages, cultures, and generations. And if you are interested in helping your church to become accessible in many languages, go ahead and check it out at www.spf.io. Thanks, and until next time.